Good morning. This panel was to be introduced by a Home Office representative, but none was forthcoming. So I'm afraid it falls to me to set the scene. Interestingly, I've just returned from a week in Italy, where by sheer chance... Oh, sorry. Sorry, we're having a little bit of technical problems here. Yes, so I've just returned from a holiday in Italy where by sheer chance a Home Office immigration expert, he actually organises their international migration conferences, which take place in places like Mexico City and Beijing. Interesting how they spend their money. And his wife were staying in the same hotel. We actually joined them regularly for breakfast as they were intelligent and convivial people, and they were two of the only other 4 guests in the hotel. We did, sadly, however, have to agree that international students were off our conversational agenda. Perhaps irritatingly, from my point of view, they left on the morning of Theresa May's speech to the Conservative Party conference, but then timing is, of course, everything. This speech from Theresa May brought mixed messages and some unjustified and I think very unfair accusations. She said, for example, that she didn't care what university lobbyists have to say. Yet those lobbyists are, in many cases, her party's constituents and indeed voters. She went on to address a potential role for providers to ensure that students leave at the conclusion of their courses. Another devolution of border responsibilities to those not in a position to enforce them. Also, I guess, an unpaid one. She also implied that we as providers do not care whether our students leave when their visas expire or not, although there is no evidence whatsoever to support such a view. It is a puzzling paradox that at a time when the Home Office is demanding that the educational sector assume some responsibilities for immigration controls, that no attempt to engage with us on the development of policies or procedures is taking place. The initial consultative body, the Joint Educational Task Force, became dysfunctional and was abandoned. Its successor, the Educational Sector Forum, has been cancelled twice and has managed to meet only once in the past 12 months. And as Alex said, that's 12 months when a lot of things have been happening. Actually, in fairness, much of the Home Secretary's original work in rooting out and closing bogus colleges, we would strongly support, as such institutions were bad for our reputation internationally and a blight on an otherwise excellent UK education brand. Neither would we take issue with the removal of those who have outstayed the terms of their visas. Very few students, however, we're told probably less than 2%, fall into this category. What concerns us is the damage done to UK education as an export by ever tighter visa rules and amateurish questioning of legitimate students with valid visas by unqualified immigration officers and the present, but hopefully soon to be reversed, insistence of including students in net migration targets. Taking the last point first, it's illogical to say that there is no limit to legitimate international students whilst including them in a net migration figure which the Home Office is pledged to reduce. The market for international students wishing to further their education through an English language medium is increasing year on year. So even if we were only to maintain our market share, and for the good of UK PLC, the government should be helping us and urging us to increase it, there would be more students coming to start their courses in any one year than those leaving on graduation. Thus, the government should have a target, as is the case in Germany, for example, for the numbers of such students to increase year on year. The German target could well be achieved given that country's decision to include international students in their provision of free state-funded higher education. Germany, it would seem, fully recognises the additional benefits brought by international students to both the providing institutions and to the country generally. Recent figures show that enrolments of fee-paying international students in Australia rose by over 10% in the last year, while Canada has launched an international education strategy which aims to double international student enrolment by 2022, and they grew at 11% last year. For those that don't know, we actually shrank a year ago and have grown by 3% this year. Now, any such increase in numbers coming to the UK is incompatible with current Home Office policy and does bring, I feel, discredit to the government's understanding of simple statistics and must thus be challenged. Remove students who are not permanent migrants from the net migration targets, and then it is possible both to achieve those targets and to grow a vital and thriving export industry. The recent introduction of interviews by visa officers would be farcical were it not so damaging to our international credibility. Over the past 2 years, the number of students interviewed as part of the process has expanded exponentially. As of this year, applicants from countries previously exempt from such activities can expect to face questioning on their intentions for studying in the UK. This has become a key facet of Home Office policy, and we would welcome an open and transparent conversation on how to ensure that students' intentions are to study. Some applicants have been refused entry because they did not know the number of students in the classes they were going to take. I put it to you that no native student would expect to know the answer to such a fatuous question. Yet those refusals have been upheld on appeal. Other nonsensical reasons for denying entry have included not knowing the details of course modules and not applying to sufficient alternative courses. Most recently, there has been the threat of increasing the threshold levels of English language required for courses. Why on earth would a reputable university, school, or college accept a student if that institution was not convinced that the student could complete the course successfully? It would seem that the Home Secretary rates her formulaic selection process more highly than the tested and proven academic judgments of receiving institutions. Surely, this balance needs to be redressed. Recent changes, in addition to higher English language thresholds, have further eroded academic judgment. The Home Office has removed the academic progression judgment for providers if students apply from outside the UK. This means that a student may apply for any course, regardless of level and regardless of previous study. But credibility interviews will now judge academic progression. This allows visa officers to become the arbiters of academic progress, yet they have neither the capability nor the credibility to make such academic judgments. Is it not time for BIS to reclaim these types of judgment for those qualified to make them? Changes to the English language requirements will also affect school-age young people aged 16 and 17 who wish to study foundation courses rather than A-levels. They are now required to take an approved secure English test as they are no longer eligible for Tier 4 child visas. IELTS, great as it is not really an appropriate test for their age and experience, as they should instead be studying English in an academically supportive environment as an integral part of their foundation course. And this, of course, is in the context of the world's secure English language testing centres being reduced from upwards of 15,000 to just 110. In the UK, there are now only 20 centres for tests which may be used for a Tier 4 visa. Some of those students, aged 16 and 17, who had made a decision based on one set of requirements, were given very little transitional help to meet the extremely different requirements of a T4 general visa. When I was running a major independent school and accepting overseas boarders, we used carefully devised tests to decide on the potential of each candidate. Now, if a student scored over 90% on our maths test, I would take him totally irrespective of the standard of his English. All such candidates got top grades at A-level and good degrees from Russell Group universities. Highly intelligent candidates improve their language skills rapidly in an English-speaking environment when they're given some special help. Conversely, there were candidates with very good English who sadly could not have coped with the requirements of maths and physics at A-level, and obviously they were not accepted. That was an academic, and I think a proper academic judgment. Immigration rules for students change too frequently, usually without any real consultation, often at very short notice, and timed to coincide with the height of the admissions season. It's hardly surprising, therefore, that providers and those who support them struggle to keep up. It also makes the system confusing for students who are given the impression that the UK, unlike our rivals in America, Australia, and Canada, doesn't really want them. Such precipitate changes in immigration rules have also, in several cases, resulted in legitimate, innovative, and flexible routes designed to meet the specific needs of students being denied to international applicants. This cannot be the way to encourage a highly valuable export industry. Moving forward, the Home Office has established that they will not focus on students as part of the immigration bill or primary legislation process. There is, however, much that can be changed in immigration rules and guidance outside of this process, and it is likely we will continue to see high rates of change. In removing the title Highly Trusted Sponsor in April of this year, the Home Office signalled the possibility of some sponsors being trusted differently than others. We encourage open discussions on the current tiered system of sponsors, which is defined on traditional funding models rather than any value judgments on the quality of their recruitment processes or indeed the education they offer. The Conservative Manifesto promised to reform the student visa system, a system which has been continuously changed since the new coalition government came to power some 5.5 years ago. If this pledge is set to define the next 4 years of student immigration policy, then all indications suggest that a large part of the coming policy will focus on the behaviour of sponsors in the context of immigration control. How sponsors meet this challenge and how it impacts the welcome we're able to give students on behalf of the UK will define this key economic area in the foreseeable future. As I indicated earlier, recent media coverage suggests that the Prime Minister may be moved to act in accordance with the advice of his Business Secretary, Foreign Secretary and Chancellor that students should be removed from net migration targets. We must hope he does act, and soon. Our industry is world-class and highly successful. With full government backing, we could easily add 5% growth per year to the £18 billion plus we currently earn for UK PLC. And we should be aiming even higher to match the double-digit growth achieved recently by Australia and Canada. I hope this helps to set the scene for our panel this morning. I'll now ask members of the panel to come to the platform, then introduce themselves and comment briefly before responding to specific questions. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you would like to join me. Since we've started first, we'd like to start at that end and we'll move along.
My name is Gordon Mackenzie. I am the Chief Executive of Guild AG, which is one of the two former representative bodies for UK higher education. And before that, I was a Deputy Director in BIS. Do you want me to just say anything?
Yes, yeah.
I mean, briefly, and there's very little to add to Graham's excellent opening remarks. I suppose 2 points that I would just make, one in a sense from my past and one from my current role. I was much concerned with regulation, sensible regulation, sensibly applied and consistently applied, can be a tool which supports UK industries in doing what they do well and in exporting. It does seem to me that we have a wholly irrational approach to regulation in respect of international students, and thus instead of supporting the industry, we are constantly knocking at it and doing damage. The second thing that I would just say from the perspective of an organisation which counts a number of smaller and highly specialist institutions among its members, is that the application of sort of one-size-fits-all rules can have a particularly damaging effect when dealing with such institutions. So, for example, when you apply percentage tests, percentage failure tests, this can be particularly damaging where you are in fact recruiting small numbers of students, maybe a high proportion, but small numbers of students, and where the sorts of oddities of the credibility questions can have such a damaging effect. And also not recognising that there are very, very good reasons why, with a specialist institution, you might limit your choice of institutions to whom you apply, simply because they are among the best ones in the world for the thing you want to do. I'll stop there for now.
Hello everyone, my name is Marie Clark. I'm the Policy and Advocacy Director at Hobsons. Hobsons, you may know as a company who supports universities around the world recruit both domestic and international students. We provide technology and services that helps them. Many universities do that. We work with about 1,500 universities globally and 50 in the UK. And I guess through that work that we've done with the 50 in the UK, we have some reflections, I guess, which I'll just mention a couple of them to start off with, which are relevant to this debate on international students in particular. When it comes to international students, I started working at Hobsons about 4 years ago, around the time that the first changes were made to the post-study work visa. We handle inquiries on behalf of a lot of universities, and it was at that point that we saw the inquiries drop quite significantly from particularly countries like India, who value the post-study work visa. So in the UK, an almost instantaneous drop as soon as those things were announced. And then in Australia, because we also work in Australia as well and support a lot of universities there with their international recruitment, we saw a surge in inquiries going to Australia. And of course, that's been borne out in the figures that Graham mentioned in terms of the impact on actual enrolments in universities. And I guess that would be my first point, is to think about the evidence that we've got and the real-time evidence that we've got about the impact that the policy changes that are happening have. As a sector, we couldn't really lobby at the time about the impact, but now we're able to say, well, you know, we had a drop in inquiries, and Marketing 101 tells you that if you don't have inquiries in the first place, you're never going to get sales. So further down that pipeline. And I guess the second point that I would make, and it relates to that, we did quite a lot of work, and some of you will be familiar with the work we did on international student decision making. It's asking the students themselves what their perception of the UK is, and what else they're considering and what's affecting their decision making. And we've done a lot of work, and we may get to discuss some of that during the panel discussion about what's putting the students off. And I guess I'll crack straight to the headline, which is, the headline this year is that 36% of the students that decided not to come to the UK didn't come because of the post-study work visa. They cited that as the number one reason. So I guess I'll just wrap up there by saying just real-time evidence and listening to what the students have to say.
It'd be very good to come back to that point later, because I can also quote some research on high school students in China taking British A-levels, which comes along with that, but doesn't depend on the post-study work route. So there are other reasons as well.
Certainly are.
It's a very important one. Sam.
Thank you. Graham gave an excellent overview of the case, I think, for removing international students from the migration cap. But I want to give a little bit of background to that, starting with the fact that the migration cap almost certainly was invented off the cuff about 10 minutes before Theresa May was due to give a speech in the run-up to the 2010 election. It was not briefed to the press. It was reputedly a surprise to all of her colleagues in the shadow cabinet at the time, and it was something that apparently got her into quite a bit of trouble. Once it was out there, once it was made, it was something that they had to commit to. And the fact that the rest of the government has been so difficult or has been dragging its heels so much in implementing this, I think very wisely, I'm very glad that they have been doing this, I think is an indication of just how divided the government is on this. Particularly, as Graham mentioned, BIS, and the kind of incoherence that we see between government departments on the migration cap goes to the very heart of the incoherence behind the thinking of the migration cap. The Conservative Party manifesto in 2010 and in 2015 argued for this migration cap to protect British workers. I don't think the economics is very good on that, but that's neither here nor there today. It's very difficult to make the case that students in any way, shape or form are a threat to British workers, particularly if they're unable to work while they're doing their, doing their study here. The general case that's being made for this is also to do with overpopulation and so on. But one of the key points about students is that the flow is very large. The flow is up to 200,000 depending on the year, but the stock is very small relative to that. So the stock of students that we have here is about 300,000. So unlike all other immigrant groups where people come and stay for a long time, and I don't agree with the concerns that people have about that, but they are there and they exist. Those concerns cannot apply to such a small stock of people. So this is a fundamental incoherence within the government policy. Interestingly, the public seems to have a more nuanced view of immigration than the government does. The public, when asked, which groups of incoming people do you consider to be immigrants, or do you consider to be kind of falling within this? 29% say that students should be counted as immigrants in this case. Maybe as a sign of the kind of public's own fluid views of this, I guess is the polite term for kind of ignorance. Less than 40% of the public wants student visas to be restrictive as part of the migration cap, compared to over 60% of the public who wants unskilled workers to be capped. So the public has quite a nuanced view of this. It is slightly incoherent if more people think that we should restrict students than think that students actually count as immigrants, but that's fine. It's very, very interesting that the public differentiates between students and unskilled workers, and the government doesn't. So I think there's a very good case politically for taking students out of the migration cap, and I certainly think that the kind of work being done by Study UK and other kind of groups may be pushing at an open door, because one of the kind of interesting things in BIS is that they don't regard lobbyists or kind of industry representatives as being kind of special interest groups. They regard them as being partners to work with and to learn from. The Home Office doesn't usually think in this way. The Home Office thinks of itself as a fortress being attacked from all sides by industry groups that constantly snipe at them. BIS wants to work with industry groups. BIS wants to learn from industry groups. And when you speak to people at the very top, special advisors and so on, they recognize that they need to work with the industry because they just simply don't know enough about these things to make good policy. I think we need to acknowledge that the Home Office does, and for possibly good reason, want to keep out certain so-called bogus students. I think they have made reasonably good progress on that, possibly using sledgehammers to crack walnuts, but recognizing that and compromising by, for example, only exempting university students from the migration cap might be one way of granting some of the government's aims while still, in large part, achieving the kind of goals that I think everybody here wants. And also something that I would point people towards is the work done by the Adam Smith Institute's sister think tank, the Entrepreneurs Network, on the graduate entrepreneur visa. Because the graduate entrepreneur visa is extremely unwieldy, given that almost nobody at that point can have the funds that they need to actually start a business. But lots of people have the know-how and the idea. So if we switched from a graduate entrepreneur's visa to a startup visa that was sponsored by accelerators who have a reputational interest in only sponsoring the good prospects, then we could open up the prospect of people staying who have good ideas and really capturing some of the global entrepreneurial talent that is already in the UK studying at UK universities, but right now we're losing. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm Carl Ligo. I'm the Vice Chancellor of BPP University and the Chief Exec of BPP Professional Education. Just to give this some practical context, we recruit into the United Kingdom 5,000 students from overseas outside of the EU each year. Our visa refusal rate is less than 2%. It's possible, and we've grown our student numbers from about 750 international students in 2000 to 5,000 this year. It's possible to be successful within the current visa regime. And I think what we've heard from everybody this morning is the usual anti-Home Office rhetoric. What I would say to everybody is, your campaign's not going very well, is it? So we need to do something different. And I think what we need to do is not, as Sam's just suggested, treat the Home Office as if they're not a willing partner. That's not something that I have found the case to be. In fact, they are willing to engage and they are prepared to talk, providing you're going to be rational when you go and speak to them. BPP is a great example of how you can have a successful operation if you do things the right way. And now, when Graham said that we all recruit students with the intention that they will pass, I think he's right for those of us that are genuinely in this for the purposes of education. Quite frankly, it's naive to think that our sector has got its house in order. It hasn't. And that's part of the issue. There are bogus students. They're very clearly bogus students. We recruit in 186 different countries. We see what's going on. We know who the abusers are. This is taking place. Unless you help the Home Office to address these issues, we are all going to be hit with a big stick. And it's all well and good to say that government is divided. As I understand it, in the last 48 hours, Biz has got a lot closer to the Home Office. So I'm not sure it's as divided as you think. Things are coming down the pipeline that will make it a little bit tougher for those who are abusers of the system. I think the starting point has got to be that the UK is still going to be an attractive place for students to come and study, but it's genuine students. And the decline in Hobsons inquiries might be due to non-genuine students now making inquiries. Who knows? I'm trying to put a different side of the spin of the argument here, because all we're hearing is, let's bash the Home Office. Your campaign's not working. That's what Theresa May is saying. Your campaign is not going to work. So what are we going to do about it? And I think there are ways in which we can work together in order to make things better. Taking students out of net migration will not change a thing. Okay? There will still be the issue of bogus students, and there will still be a visa regime. We operate in Germany. The immigration track for students wanting to enter Germany is not dissimilar in practice to the United Kingdom. There are still credibility interviews. There is still a requirement that you've got to have cash in your account. They're still looking at the genuineness of the education provider. So don't be taken in that somehow in the UK everything is rotten and bad. It's not. You can operate, you can work within the rules. And I think we, in our independent sector, are going to be thrown under the bus by the public sector if we don't get our own house in order.
Would you like to comment on that?
I would agree that taking students out of the net migration target doesn't provide an answer. It doesn't stop everything else. And I think to think that it does stop everything else would be wrong. But I do stick by my point that I think the current approach to regulation is an irrational one. I think you can have sensible and you can address public concerns in sensible ways, but I don't think that they are currently sensible.
Just another point in regards to how the students view the UK. I think the regulation behind the scenes, that's one that we're all very aware of, but the students themselves, they have a perception of what the UK is, and how we asked the students what was most important to them when choosing to study overseas and choosing a destination country. And the first two factors, no surprise, academic rankings, quality of education, that's the why they would study abroad. But when it came to the second factors, which were the perception of the country's attitude towards international students, so how they view the country's attitude towards international students, and the safety of the destination country are really the two things about why they choose a particular country themselves. So the first two, why they would go and study abroad in the first place, the second two, where they would choose. And I think we're all very much aware of the headlines that are created, and maybe we're guilty of creating some of the headlines ourselves, but the headlines that are created create a perception, whether it's right or wrong. Carl, you mentioned Germany is very similar, but the perception is that the UK is closed and doesn't want international students.
Well, hang on, let me just challenge this. So there are wider geopolitical issues than just the student visa regime. Students are saying that I'm a Muslim student. Am I going to be welcome in the United Kingdom, given its foreign policy and its attitude in the Middle East? There are wider issues than just saying, oh, it's down to the Home Office. You've got to work through those issues, and recruitment might be down because of our other, foreign policies. It's not just down to this issue. I'm sorry, I'm deliberately being provocative because I don't see the campaign that's been waged for the last 5 years as being successful. So we need something different.
Any comments? Yes.
I can agree with Carl. I run an education group or region group. We don't have that many students as Carl, but we have got 100 students. But the Home Office, we can have a dialogue. Even there are instances whereby our percentage is more than the threshold. But when you go and talk to them about why those percentages are higher, and these are the reasons, what was in our control, and they were able to listen. And I think that Carl's point is absolutely right. As long as we as educational operators have the right integrity, and if we can be in education for the right reasons, UKBA or UKBI now will listen. And we've been a trusted sponsor for the last 10 years now, and we never had a problem. And when there is a problem, there is clear engagement. And I think they can see through who is the genuine operator and who is just trying to abuse our system. As long as they are not abusing, we all make mistakes, but the mistakes need to be in the context of providing good quality education. And I think that rhetoric and narrative as independent providers, we are an alternative provider as well, got to go and save the market rather than simply say they're not listening.
Any other comments on this point? Perhaps I can be a little bit provocative the other way, because College International have done some research, done it twice now, 2 years ago and again last year, amongst Chinese students in Chinese high schools in units that are taking British A-levels. Now, if you're a Chinese student in a Chinese high school and you elect to take British A-levels, you immediately take yourself out of consideration for a Chinese university, because you have to go on and take the Chinese qualification if you want to go to a Chinese university. So these students are committed to going to university outside China. Surveyed 2 years ago and last year, less than 20% of those A-level students were now intending to come to the UK to study. And they are not applying to any institutions that might, even with the wildest of fancies, be termed bogus, because they're nearly all applying to Russell Group universities. And instead they're going to Australia, Canada and the US. The US will always get most of those candidates because there are more scholarships available in the US and a lot of the candidates are not very well off. However, in terms of educational quality, Britain comes out as second only to the UK and very close to it, to the US. But in terms of perception of welcome, Australia and Canada are light years ahead of us. Now, I do agree with Carl to an extent. I think there is a danger that the more we talk up problems publicly in the press, that gets reported in the Indian Times, in newspapers in Beijing and Shanghai, and put students off. But whereas I would agree that taking students out of net migration targets doesn't change the need for student visas and doesn't necessarily change the system, it does change the message, because these students are bright, they are not stupid. And if you have students in a net migration target and your aim is to reduce net migration year on year, you cannot possibly be taking more students year on year. doesn't add up. And that is my concern about keeping students in the net migration target. It gives the world a clear message that we want to reduce the number of students coming to the UK. There is no other way you can reduce net migration with students in the target. Unless I've missed something in my statistics training a long time ago anyway.
I'm Eddie Byers from English UK. From my perspective, I guess a core question here is, are students migrants? You know, it's one thing to say we want them out of the target or we don't. And from our perspective, students are definitely not migrants. And therefore, this is really a question of policy development. If you look at that migration policy as a question, I'd be interested in Sam's views on this, where you see that students being viewed as migrants has driven a set of rule changes precisely because of what Graham has been talking about and trying to reduce the net migration outcome. It is perverse as an outcome. So for me, this is about being clear about what the policy pivot is, rather than about expecting this change to deliver an outcome on its own.
I'll make a quick comment because I can ask, I can tell you what the students tell us themselves about their likelihood of migration when they're considering coming and studying abroad and thinking about what studying abroad will do for them in their career. Net migration or permanent migration to the country that they're going and studying in comes very low in their criteria for studying abroad. It's a consistent finding that we've had across the 3 years. The students themselves do not see themselves at inquiry stage, and I will caveat that with at inquiry stage. Their views may change once they get here, which I'm sure you're all aware of, but at inquiry stage they don't see studying in the UK as a route to permanent migration here. By the way, the irony of me talking as a New Zealander about immigration to this country is not lost on me, and I think it's always interesting to see who is viewed as migrants, because a lot of people say to me, well, you don't count as a migrant, I am a migrant, you know, I've come to this country, my route to this country has now been cut off, I wouldn't be able to come now. So, but students themselves, they don't view themselves as as migrants, so they wouldn't view themselves, if they were presented with the argument, as being part of net migration. The benefit that they see is around employability, around improving their skills, and they see that as something that they will gain in their home country. Most of them, their plans, at least at inquiry stage, is to go home. Perhaps after a short period of work, but to go home in the end.
So that's a very interesting point, because I don't have a strong view about what a migrant is. Does a British person who's been living abroad coming back to the UK count as an immigrant? Technically, yes. Many people would say they don't. I don't have a strong view about that. But interestingly, it's not just students who come to the UK expecting to stay for a very short period of time. Lots of workers, particularly within the European Union, come for a very short period of time, less than 5 years, and expect to return to their homes. We, unfortunately, in my opinion, dropped the last kind of guest worker visa that we have back in 2013 when Romania and Bulgaria work restrictions were lifted. I think that was a great shame. And I think a shift in the mindset behind the government's migration policy from looking at simply people who are on airplanes planning on settling in the UK for any period of time to a focus on long-term immigration might be something that pivots away in general from students and so on and so forth, and all of these temporary workers as well. But just on Carl's point about lifting students out of the cap, not fixing everything, and of course it's not going to fix everything. And in fact, actually, it's worth noting that university student visas have risen slightly over the past 5 years. They have not fallen. So we have to be careful about what we're talking about and the composition of the changes that are going on. But it's not just about sending a message to students. It's about sending a message to people within our own bureaucracy and people considering the visa system and considering visa applications and having them, what do they think of a migrant as being? And when they are looking at an edge case, Right now, I presume in most edge cases, they will err on the side of caution, which is to say no. I would prefer erring on the side of caution to mean saying yes. And that's the kind of mindset that I think would make a difference. Maybe it wouldn't solve every problem, maybe it wouldn't change things root and branch, but I think it would make a substantial difference to enough people that it's worth pushing for.
Can we move on? You mentioned, Marie, the problem as perceived by Indian applicants about not having post-university work. Now, I suspect this is much more a problem of the Indian subcontinent than it is with international students generally, because my own knowledge of, and I can get at the records of these, of the 100 plus students, Chinese students from the mainland who went through Dulwich College in my time as master, only 2 of those post-graduation are still working in England. One is working in England in the finance industry because he doesn't want to go home, because he wants to keep away from his rather bossy mother who wants him to take over her tea planting business. And the other one is a specialist first-class engineer from Cambridge who always wanted to work in the motor racing industry, and he's in the engineering team at Red Bull. Not doing too well at present, so he may go back to China soon. We'll see. But I suspect it is the Indian one, but perhaps you'd like to comment on it.
Yes, we have. I don't have. I'm just quickly looking through to see if I brought some notes about both we asked the students. We asked a lot of questions about where the students were thinking about going as alternatives, and what we found was that certain types of students were more mobile than more mobile in their alternatives. Say, for example, Nigerian students, if they inquire, they're very likely to come to the UK, whereas Indian students, if they inquire to the UK, a greater percentage of them are likely to go elsewhere. So the thing is, if you get an Nigerian student, you're likely to get them. Indian students, I think, see more options globally, and perhaps that is the work element to it.
Do you find a difference, Carl, in different nationalities, some wanting work experience and some not, or not?
A very large proportion of our students end up being referred by employers, so you've already linked into the sort of employment opportunities. There are clearly different characteristics depending on the subject matter that you offer and the different countries, so yeah, I guess there is. Yeah.
Are people generally concerned about the restrictions on post-graduation work or not?
Yeah.
I think this is a more difficult one to crack, although just a story of how it can improve influence. A young man in Burma who is very helpful to my company in acting as an agent for international students now, did his A-levels at a college in the UK, did a degree at Imperial, and he did a 2-year management trainee course, with Laura Ashley, which sounds rather odd for an engineer, but that's what he did. It wouldn't be allowable now because it doesn't reach the salary threshold. And yet that 2-year training course, he has gone back to Myanmar. He's been back there some 5 years now, and he is very, very pro the UK, and wants to start a school in Myanmar based on British education. So he is helping our export drive, partially because he was allowed to spend 2 years training here. Like Carl, I do actually have some sympathy with the Home Office, despite what I said earlier, and we do need to put our own house in order. I would say it's largely happened, but not entirely. I would disagree with him there. And if we are going to have training courses allowable in the UK, then they have got to be closely controlled. I would accept that. But I think it's a pity if we're going to kick them out altogether.
It's John Craig from SIE Institute. I've got a couple of general points to the discussion so far. But just before that, I can add a couple of bogus reasons for visa refusals that we've experienced. One was a student who was deemed to have his passport was in a slightly shabby state. Now, look, I don't know. Perhaps it went through the washing machine or something. This was the reason for his refusal. This was a US citizen, and when he approached the US authorities, they refused to issue him a new passport because they deemed it to be perfectly acceptable. That's one. Another one we had was a student was refused because he didn't know what SAE stood for, which is our brand. But for 35 years, we have not mentioned what it stood for originally. And that's partly because our brand strategy, we've moved on from what we were originally. It was the School of Audio Engineering, if anybody's wondering. But we teach a lot of other things now, so we don't. So again, two very real bogus reasons why visas were refused. And that affects perception. So I totally agree with the view from the panel that it is very much about perceptions, both in terms of the net immigration numbers. I totally agree that sends out a very, very damaging signal. But also in terms of switching. You know, there are a lot of very reputable agents out there. Now, those agents that are focused very much on UK, of course, we're all trying to work within the compliance regime. Those agents that are specialised on UK, you know, have a vested interest in sort of talking about, yes, you can work within the rules, and et cetera, but there are a lot of very reputable agents out there who can easily switch a student to somewhere else. You know, students may not be 100% determined to come to the UK. And anyway, you know, how determined do they need to be? That might be their first preference. Okay, but if an agent who's got 30 years of experience and has very, very good results says, well, you know what, you've got a much higher risk of having your visa refused for bogus reasons, and if you go to Australia, there's a post-study work visa, and et cetera, et cetera. There are working rights while you're there, even if you're in a private higher education institute, et cetera. That student may think again, even if his or her first choice was the UK. So I think we do need to take that sort of perception point very, very seriously. Thanks.
I have a question for Gordon. We obviously do meet regularly with the Home Office, policy officials, compliance officials, and generally we want to help them. Although we have concerns about the overall policy, we want to help them implement their policy in the least damaging method possible. But we often find in recent months, of last year or so, that policies are sort of brought in without any proper consultation, and we try to sort of mitigate their impact after the fact with evidence of how it will affect people, how it will affect businesses. We see policies brought in without any accompanying impact assessment, even though we know the impact will actually be significant. What, in your experience working for the government, what kind of evidence and how should we present the evidence to help to get the Home Office to think again about how to implement some of these policies?
I mean, I suppose it is important, and I think this is what people seek to do, to provide clear, reasoned, well backed up. I think there's a distinction between sort of shouting loudly or making an argument and actually being able to demonstrate the impact that changes have or that particular approaches have. And you do that, and you hope that the only transaction that is going on is a logical transaction about evidence. But I suppose sometimes other things are going on, and and one of those is politics. I mean, the point Marie made earlier about not being able to prejudge what the impact of a change would be, but then being able to monitor the impact of that change and then present evidence as to the impact of that change. I think these are all the right sorts of approaches, and if people wish to hear them, then they will hear them. But it isn't always as simple as that.
Morning, Paul Kirkham, Chief Executive of the ICMP. Slightly left field question. Trade is successful when it works both ways. are we doing enough to export students? And I'm thinking now about flexibility in the systems that we have, particularly at the level of higher education. We have this reliance on a 3-year residential model. It's very fixed, hasn't really changed in 500 years, I suppose. We have all sorts of tools and opportunities available to us, the use of online technology, for example. There are different ways to deliver the British education brand much more flexibly to both national and international students. And if one looks at it from a moral, geopolitical point of view, I think we could do a lot worse than have larger numbers of our young people studying abroad. And I was interested, actually, statistically, whether there is any sign of an increase in British students being exported, basically, for education. Thank you.
Well, I mean, I'm not so much exporting British students overseas, but certainly creating the pathway to be able to study in multiple countries we're seeing a lot of. And I guess our low visa refusal rate is a good illustration of putting foundations in various countries helps, because then you are not falling foul of credibility interviews, because they know that the local visa office knows the institution, knows the type of students that come through. So if you, as an independent provider, have got the capability and the resources to be able to do it, it mitigates your risk, definitely. But I don't see a lot of students going the other way. It's not really the British thing, is it, at the moment?
I mean, there are more courses now where you can spend 1 year of a degree course abroad, even if you're not studying languages. And I think those courses are increasingly popular, but it's going up very slowly from a low base. And I hear what you say, Paul, and certainly in terms of being employable in what is increasingly a multinational employment market, it would be much better, I would say, for more of our students to spend some of their time in another country, in another culture, as well as a language base, and it would make them more employable, but I don't think it's happening to any great extent.
No, I agree. I wonder if it's just worth commenting on some of the things that I think might come down the pipeline. The more we focus on post-study work visas, the more you're reinforcing the issue that people are just coming here to work, not really to study. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword that we've got to work on that. The most helpful that I've heard the Home Office suggest is that providers with low visa refusal rates, good completion rates, and can count students out will earn the right to have a post-study work visa. So that's at the high point that I've seen. The other things that I've heard is that the visa refusal rate will drop from its current 10% to 5%. That there'll only be IELTS that's accepted as the standard, and the universities will lose the right to have their own English language entry test. And I think the one that would be really very difficult to deal with is that all providers would have a duty to count out a student, in other words, to make sure that they've left these islands. I'm not sure how that one's going to work. You know, if I have a nightmare scenario, it's what's the duty on me to escort students off the island?
Well, looking at what happens in security companies around the world, presumably we would all start employing ex-Home Office visa officials who wanted a more lucrative and different life. Which is a fairly horrifying thought, but I agree with you. I think that is a very likely scenario. I agree with Carl on that. And it's one we've got to be prepared for, even if we don't like it. And I did allude to it. It basically means we're going to be acting as border officials if we want to keep our ability to issue licenses, and we're going to be doing it for free, folks, because they ain't going to pay us.
Wow.
Alex, any more? Well, one more question, then we must break for coffee. Yes.
Thank you very much. Hello, my name is Ayla. I'm representing Oxford Business College today. Up until now, you guys were discussing where the students do follow, whether they are immigrants or not immigrants. To be honest with you, that's something quite stupid to actually to discuss, because in the end of the day, international students who come in this country, I will not mention India, although they do a lot for this country as well. they spent £72,000 in living costs in London and pretty much the same money in Oxford and in surrounding areas, as well as they spend over £12,000 per year in their educational fees. So obviously they bring cash into this country. Whether they do follow or they do not follow, international students do not really mind this. With regards to students and their working in this country, there are universities, including BPP as well, who do offer to students 3 to 4 years of bachelor's degree, including their study as part of their qualification. I think, personally, what we have to look more is the IELTS, where students are required to take, and that universities should not allow students to have their own English test, because that totally confuses the students and the colleges, as well as the IELTS center. So obviously, right now, we are not helping the system. We are putting these students away because there is no clear vision what they have to do. And secondly, I think there are certain gaps that the universities have to look, because to whatever they want and whatever they ask the UK government, pretty much they do get. But then they forget that there are small colleges out there who are having to suffer of the bad choices that the universities have done up until now. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think the Home Office agrees with you actually on the getting rid of the English language test for universities. I mean, I'm aware of some universities that effectively have no IELTS entry for academic programs, which sort of you begin to wonder how the students are successful in that kind of system. So, and that's not the independent sector.
I would agree. I mean, I think there are differences. A distinguished mathematician from anywhere in the world can go and get a first at Cambridge without getting any decent IELTS score at all. And I think you've got to allow maths departments in top universities to select who you want on that basis. But otherwise, I would very much agree with you that IELTS is the one route we should take. Ladies and gentlemen, we must call it a halt there. Can I thank my panel members very much for their efforts and invite you to break for coffee when Alex gives you the permission to do so.
Permission granted. Just to let you know that we're back here at 11:30 for a briefing on the new counter-terrorism prevent duty.